Hello everyone. This module's lesson focused on Shackleton quite a bit in terms of his optimism and also Quinn's article, The Fundamental State of Leadership, and then we looked at the relationship between those two articles to determine whether or not Shackleton in fact had entered the fundamental state of leadership with regard to certain dimensions like optimism. So the first question was discuss the relationship between Shackleton's mechanism for staying in touch with reality and Quinn's idea of being externally open. So some of the postings emphasized that Shackleton's optimism could have actually been sort of a hindrance to what he was trying to do because he was overly optimistic in a bad situation. Now, a chapter in the book, Good to Great, is entitled Confront the Brutal Facts. And it's interesting in there they pointed out the idea that leaders need to confront problems and predicaments that people are involved in without sugarcoating it, because there's a certain reality you have to measure what you're doing and whether or not people will buy into what you're talking about if your expectations are too unrealistic. There's an interesting discussion in Viktor Frankl's book called Man's Search for Meaning, a very good book, quite famous if you're ever interested in reading what that's all about. He was in a World War II concentration camp, and basically what he discovered in the behavior of people around him was that undue optimism created a problem. So let's say, example, a person thought, well, I think the war's going to be over by Christmas and we're all going to be out of here. And that day came and went. And what he discovered as a neuroscientist was that people actually suffered after the fact if they believed that would happen, and it didn't happen, and they suffered to the point of death. So being overly optimistic can be a problem if it's not based in anything that's true, with regard to information available. I think in Shackleton's case, he had various pieces of information that he thought could be used to get them out of their predicament, and of course, he did that. Okay, so that also relates to a comment made by Michelle Brown about being open to outside signals because of that false hope, which is the result of not paying attention at all to what is happening around you or misinterpreting the cues around you. So think about that in terms of your ability to be optimism. Are you being accurate with regard to a proper assessment? Elena made an interesting, if not subtle, differentiation between being optimistic about establishing a goal of survival while acknowledging they had to focus on their dire circumstances just to meet basic needs. So again, the reality, the brutal facts are that you have basic needs that have to be taken care of. So in the process of doing that, let's say with limited food or whatever other resources they thought they needed, having an overly optimistic perspective is important, but it's also the case that you have to face the brutal facts and go get your food and that sort of thing. And having to do that drudgery of getting the food could create the impression that it is a pessimistic situation instead of an optimistic one. Marcus commented that Shackleton believes you should be optimistic when adversity occurs, and Quinn believes that you should have an open mind. And it struck me that those two are similar in the sense that, adversity should drive a person toward pessimism, but what actually happens then in the situation depends upon the leader. So it's a natural reaction to be pessimistic in adversity because adversity is a bad thing and you don't know how it's all going to turn out. But it's the leader that's going to make the difference, and being open-minded and creating more alternatives is the thing that gives a person optimism, that there's not just one end to the whole situation that you're in. Don started by saying that it's easy to be optimistic when everything is going your way and not so when things are not going your way. Reminded me of a quote by Mike Tyson, the famous boxer, who said, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. So that gets at the idea of that process where you can be optimistic till reality sets in. Another quote that's similar to that is it's difficult to keep your head. Let me rephrase that. The quote is, can you keep your head when everyone else around you is losing theirs? And that, again, gets at the optimism issue. Okay, Don also quotes Quinn, where Quinn says leaders do their best work when they don't copy anyone and draw from their own values and capabilities. Other people cited that as well. We're headed toward more readings on what authentic leadership is all about. And the issue with authenticity versus not being authentic in your processes are that if you just copy someone else's style, you're probably going to end up in a situation that doesn't align with that type of a style. And the only way to get alignment is to be operating from the authentic person that you are with the authentic skills you have to be flexible and handle a given situation. Emily mentioned that Shackleton and Quinn's connection is through the idea that both perspectives are forever open or hopeful. Now, there's been some critique with regard to Shackleton and his being overly optimistic. But, I think taken as a whole, Shackleton's behavior really shows that he pushed his ego aside, that he was concerned about the men, he was concerned about the mission, and it wasn't necessarily about him. Asia's comments about Shackleton having an optional blind spot are interesting from the perspective that people who succeed in life probably have a lot of failures in their history. And that basically means that it took a lot of failure to get to success, and they probably pursued a lot of alternatives. And what that tells us is if you can generate alternatives to the point of being optimism, the probability that some of those alternatives are going to be blind spots and not fruitful venues or directions is just reality out there. Discussion 2, discuss optimism in terms of Shackleton and the fundamental state of leadership. Taisha made an interesting comment about always being aware that your actions and decisions can affect those around you. And I'll end the comments there with regard to this module's lesson, because otherwise this gets long. I'll put them in the discussion forum. And I want to end them there because it's an introduction to the next lesson on emotional intelligence. How are people going to react to the things you do and say around you? It's not always something that you've done emotionally, but our next lesson points to that with regard to emotional intelligence. So basically, the authors coming up, Goldman and company, assert that great leaders work through emotions, and the leader's capacity to recognize other people's emotions in the workplace and how you are going to impact them by what you do is very important. And in fact, Goldman says this is the essence of leadership. Remember that our other author, Shine, thought that culture was the essence of leadership. So this is where we get to answer the question, is it culture or is it leadership? And of course, I think we're going to say it's both in the long run. But Goldman and company make a pretty strong argument that emotions are just absolutely huge. How people react to you emotionally with their response is critical to the whole thing. Humans tacitly pick up emotional clues from others. So basically, automatically, you're going to pick up emotional clues. And it's important to remember that other people can change our feelings, emotions, and even our physiology by the way we react to them emotionally. It also happens without conscious awareness. It's nothing that you can necessarily control. So they talk about how critical that is for a leader, because these things are going to happen regardless of what people think about or how they try to control them. They go further and say, the important thing is that even bad news can be delivered well if it's done in a certain fashion so that people don't get emotionally wrought because of that. So your tone and what you do with people around you greatly impacts people at work. Now here's the final thing. They provide evidence to show that it impacts the bottom line, that the way the leader deals with emotions in the workplace has a significant impact on how the organization overall performs, and not only in terms of behavioral performance, but financial performance. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So I hope you enjoy the lessons on the lesson on primal leadership. Goldman's quite famous for his book on emotional intelligence, and then spin-offs of that became primal leadership and so forth. Thanks.